I'm here today to introduce, which is a great pleasure for me, Henry Hale. Henry Hale is, I think, one of the key figures in the modern authoritarian research right now. He is professor of political science and international affairs at the Washington University, Georgetown University, and at the same time director of the program of new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. He is actually really someone who did not only study Central Eastern Europe, Eurasia, Russia from far away, but he did with his own foot a lot of fieldwork in the region and wrote very important and influential books in a comparative perspective with a focus on Russia, but also Ukraine, and plenty of articles, influential and important articles. I just would like to mention a few books, and some of them you might meet during your study here at the Institute. His most recent monograph, published in 2015, is on patronal politics, Eurasia regime dynamics in comparative perspective. And everyone who is interested in understanding what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, but also in post-Soviet regions, I heavily advise to read this book, even if it's not in your literature, obligational literature. Apart from authoritarianism research or included in, better to say, in his research on authoritarianism and hybrid regimes, actually I think you coined this term, hybrid regimes, he also focused on federalism and ethnic politics. So his second book, monograph, published in 2006, Why Not Parties in Russia, Democracy, Federalism, and the State. And he also quite recently published, edited a book about Ukraine, also in a comparative perspective with the title Beyond the Euromaidan, Comparative Perspectives of Advancing Reform in Ukraine, 2016. I warmly welcome you to Berlin, and with great joy I listen to your talk, to your lecture. We will have, as usual, first the lecture and then the discussion. And if everything is set, we will have a small reception afterwards. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words, for the invitation and the welcome. It's my pleasure to be here. I look forward to a very interesting conversation with you all. Basically, what I want to talk about today is what we might call Russia's place in the great post-Soviet puzzle of regimes. And I think this will touch on kind of how Russia relates to Russian politics today, connects with revolutions past and the politics over the last century, up until the current day, where I think the logic of hybrid regimes. I wish I could claim that term, but I don't even know who coined it, but I certainly have made a good use of that because I think it is a useful concept for understanding Russian politics today, as well as many other regimes in the post-Soviet space. So this great puzzle that I've outlined here in the slides is, first of all, we see now that we are basically 25 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of these countries, 15 independent countries that emerged from it. A great diversity in regime type. Russia's actually kind of in the middle. On one end, you have countries in the Baltics that are already democracies in the European Union, whereas on the other hand, you have countries that are much more authoritarian than Russia, or much more, closer to dictatorships like Turkmenistan, where you even, up until not too long ago, had golden statues of the dictator rotating to face the sun. And so now you have a slightly different shape of the dictator there. And so you have a wide variety of regimes, but you also have a great degree of dynamism of these regimes. And so it's not like the Soviet Union collapsed and then suddenly you had countries' political systems looking like they look today. In fact, Turkmenistan looks pretty much the same. The Baltic states maybe look pretty much the same, but all the other countries in between have changed quite dramatically over the years, and not always in one direction. In fact, I think kind of moving in one direction is in some ways an exception rather than the norm. So what I tried to do in my various aspects of work is, of course I cannot escape the intellectual concepts that I was brought up with and learned about, but to try and think about how the system works as best I can by looking on the ground in Russia and other former Soviet countries where I've tried to spend as much time as I can developing concepts that somehow grow naturally out of the milieu itself. And so it sort of winds up being a dialogue between the theories that I found useful for understanding human political behavior and the patterns that I've seen around me that aren't necessarily theorized. And so I call this general pattern control politics. And I think this can be quite useful for thinking about how we can understand the dynamism and patterns that we see in the former Soviet space, including Russia, especially in the post-Soviet period, but I also think it's useful for thinking over the longer durée, and how we can explain Russia in particular. So just to preview the main points of the argument, and so no surprise to those of you who have read my book, I think the context of patronalism, and I'll say what that means in a minute or two, is key to understanding the politics of this region. And in this particular context, I think one of the implications is that politics are inherently, at a minimum, changing constantly. So it has a protean nature to them. But I think it's also cycles of movements and changes in regime tend to be apparent. These cycles can be irregular or regular, they can be long or short, but they do provide some structure to patterns that we see over time. I think more recently in the post-Soviet space, we've seen actually a trend towards more regularity in the cycles of change that we've seen, meaning they're a little more predictable than they were initially. But again, it's an open question where things will go after, in the future, obviously. So what do I mean by patronalism? Basically, patronalism is what I call a social equilibrium, so self-reinforcing social outcome, in which the collective pursuit of political or economic needs and ends tends to be organized mainly through personalized rewards and punishments meted out to specific individuals through networks of actual personal acquaintance. And so basically this is a society where connections matter. When people organize to do things, it's usually through some kind of extended network of your own connections, or you know somebody who knows somebody, and this is how things get mobilized to get something done. And so this is distinct from patterns of politics that are often theorized in developed countries of the West, including the United States, which is the one I know best, and the politics of what Benedict Anderson has called imagined communities. And so what Anderson means by imagined communities is not that they're made up or false, but what he means is that politics often organizes among people who imagine themselves as a community, who think of themselves as a community, but have not actually met in person, and are not necessarily linked through a chain of actual personal acquaintance. And so, for those of you who've studied the United States, politics often mobilizes around broad issues that people identify with. So you might mobilize through the National Organization of Women, or the National Rifle Association, and you might donate money to them. You might send a check to them, even though you don't know anybody there, right? But you kind of trust somehow that this mobilization will be effective. Whereas in most of the former Soviet space, including Russia, that kind of behavior, it's not that it never happens, but it's fairly rare. People don't, as a rule, donate money to some abstract organization or cause unless they know somebody working through it. Know somebody who can kind of lend credibility to the effort. So again, not to say that it never happens, but it fairly rarely happens. And so the way people get things done is by working through people that you know. And that's one reason why parties in Russia, for example, are often criticized as being kind of these top-down, leader-oriented parties. And that's because oftentimes parties are, in fact, composed largely of the extended personal networks of the leaders. So people they know, people they work with, and people who know them. And you get some people who join in according to the ideas and maybe make connections that way, but that tends to be not how the parties, not the core of those parties, at least most of them, again, with some exceptions, which I'm happy to talk about. And one of the important points here, which I point out here at the bottom of the slide, is that this kind of organization of society, I think it's useful to think about as the world historical norm, not something that's kind of deviant or unusual. And if you just think back about how human history would have arisen, the smallest human communities were small enough for everybody to know each other. So of course it's natural that one would be operating through personal connections. And so when you extend a polity's control to other communities or regions, oftentimes it went through identifying local networks or establishing people in place who would make these connections forcibly or by co-opting them, and governing through these extended political networks. So if you read the history of how the Russian Empire expanded, for example, into different territories, that was often how it would work. It would find locals that it could work with and somehow co-opt, and would kind of work them into the czarist system, except in those cases where the local community would basically be kind of obliterated or destroyed. So those were kind of the two options. In this sense, kind of the developed West, in kind of having this large degree of impersonal politics, is an exception and something that appeared only fairly recently in world historical time. So we often think about kind of the effects of patronalism or what it is. I mean, we can think about like a number of different things that tend to go along with it, and these are pretty readily identifiable, and there are all kinds of measures. And so I don't think that patronalism boils down to any of these things, but there's close associations that help us identify which countries are more patronal than others. Patronalistic countries tend to be high in corruption, have weak rule of law, low social capital of the impersonal sort that Robert Putnam, for example, theorizes about. Patrimonialism, neo-patrimonialism, kind of good Weberian terms, are describing something very similar with respect to authority structures. Clientelism, patron-client relations, these are all concepts that are highly associated with patronalism. And so I'm definitely not trying to supplant these terms. I just think patronalism is a description of the broader social context that gives rise to a lot of these other phenomena. And one important aspect of it is that I call it equilibrium because it functions as a vicious cycle. It's self-reinforcing in a certain way. So if you talk to people in Russia, Ukraine, they don't like, for example, that positions of power tend to go to relatives or close associates of the people that are elected, right? They don't like nepotism, or competitions for jobs often work by who you know. They don't like this in principle. They don't like corruption. But at the same time, in their everyday life, people take advantage of these things when they have that opportunity. So you might be very deeply opposed to having to pay a bribe to get an appointment with a doctor, but when your son or daughter is in need of some kind of urgent surgery, and that's what the doctor's demanding, you're going to do it. Or even if the doctor isn't demanding it, people may actually propose it anyway to try and jump the queue if they're feeling desperate. So people take advantage of it at the same time that they don't like it. But I think the key is, why this is the case, is that it makes sense to take advantage of it from a certain point of view, and arguably even a certain moral point of view, if you really think that this is the norm, this is how things work. And I think that's often just how people accept it. This is just how things work. And so you're forced to make certain very difficult choices within that type of system. So one example that I give in the book, but you can take from lots of different forms, is say you are a member of parliament from a highly patronalistic country, and say you are representing a particular geographic district. If you want to serve the interests of those people, you're going to do what you can to bring in jobs, bring in economic investment, and bring in development. And in this particular type of context, if you refuse to pay anyone off to get the resources you need for that, to bring in the investment, to do what it takes to bring in those resources for your own constituents, you're very likely to be seen as incompetent. So people might see you as kind of standing on your high horse and carrying on about your own moral authority. But if you don't actually do things for people that actually make lives concretely better, you may be regarded in a negative light, not a positive light. And this goes on for all kinds of personal examples as well. So there's a strong tendency in the system for people to want to, it's not that they like doing it, but they think it's necessary in order to get something real done. So not all this corruption, as we call it, is venal in the sense of being about personal gain. A lot of it is just people doing what they think they need to do in order to get something done. But critically, the key is they expect that this is the norm. So this legislator, say he just stood on his high horse and didn't do it, basically somebody else is going to move in and take these resources. So kind of this all depends on people thinking that, if I don't do it, nothing's going to get done. Other people are doing it, therefore this is just the way things have to go. So the reason it's hard to change then is because there's just a very deeply embedded expectation based on the normal as people experience it growing up and in their professional lives as to just how things get done. So you have to change it, you really have to change not only people's practices or their willingness to participate in this activity, but their expectations. You have to convince them not only that you can make a change in your own life, but that everybody else is going to make a change, and that this change is going to last. And that becomes something that's extremely hard to do. And I think the Russian Revolution is one example that maybe helps illustrate this, and I'll come to it in a moment. If we want to look at kind of which countries are patronalistic in the world, I showed you a map earlier. In my book and elsewhere, I've relied on a typology of countries that was developed by Herbert Kitschelt and several colleagues of post-communist regimes. And so basically they did a categorization based on which regimes have the strongest patrimonial element, which, as I mentioned before, is a concept that is highly related to patronalism, sort of regarding the merger of kind of private and public interests. And what we see is that pretty much all the former Soviet countries except the Baltics fall into the category of the most patronalistic or patrimonial countries. The Baltic countries fall into the moderately patronalistic ones, and then a lot of the East Central Europe are among the less patronalistic countries, although there's some interesting dynamics here as well in places like Hungary. I think this abstract social logic has some very important implications for how politics takes place and how politics works. And so I'll outline a few of them here that I think are relevant. And the first one is that the most important collective political actors in this type of society, I think it's useful to think about them mostly as extended networks of actual political acquaintance. So these are broad, extended power networks of people that are linked through these personal connections, not so much by ideas. And I think that these networks are more important actors in kind of the moving and shaking of politics than are formally defined institutions like political parties, which we would normally look to in the West as normal actors, as major actors. Parliament, even the state, I think, it tends to be composed of in part or comprised by these different networks. Firms or even social movements. And the important point, I think, one of the important points is that a very powerful network interpenetrates all of these different forms of organization, or at least a large majority of them. So if you're a powerful network, you might have your people in not only a party, but if you're a really strong network, you have your people in multiple parties, including parties that are diametrically opposed, because you want to hedge your bets. So in the Russian case, this has involved, like oligarchs contributing to the Communist Party as well as to the Market Reform Party. You want to have your people in parliament, you have your representatives in the presidency and the state offices, you might have your business interests, you probably own some kind of media if you're a really powerful network, you might even have social movements that you can mobilize at different points in time to back you up, or civil society organizations. So these networks are kind of penetrating all of these formal institutions, but they can act in concert when necessary for mobilizing political force. And they're roughly hierarchical. So let me actually give you a few examples. So in terms of Russian politics, for those of you who have studied it, you talk, or even just reading the news about it, right? One powerful set of oligarchs, of networks we call oligarchs, right? And so sometimes we just think of these as particularly powerful business people, but in fact, it's a whole set of connections that they have, that they mobilize. So, again, they buy their people in parliament, they buy their people in the state, they have their own media, not just business. Regional political machines are kind of the same kind of thing based out of state structures at the local level. In places, especially Central Asia, we can talk about clan networks, although usually they're not actually based on kinship. They might have a kinship core, but they incorporate anyone else who could be useful to them politically, who they have some connection with. State-based networks, such as Vladimir Putin's, those people that he's been able to build relationships up through his position in the state. And if we go back earlier in Russian history, before the Soviet period, you'd have the boyar family network. So, some of the historical research on Russia, like John Ladon and others, they write about the czarist families competing against each other, basically competing for influence, and that this was a large part of the political experience in czarist Russia. And in the Soviet period as well, you had these different kind of chains of command of different members of the Politburo who would have their people in the party structure kind of moving up or down with them. So just a little more concrete. I don't know how well people can see the typescript here, but this is just a concrete example of one particularly powerful network in Russia in 1999-ish, when the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, was competing for the presidency. So in competing for the presidency, it wasn't just Lushkov with some campaign support staff and a national reputation and a platform competing for people's hearts and minds. In fact, as Moscow mayor, he had a huge concrete network that can be traced through these actual personal acquaintances from different phases of his life, or different aspects of his life, that would mobilize for him when competing for the presidency. And so, if you just kind of look here, he's the Moscow mayor, he's there at the top. Of course, he has his Moscow city administration, but that means that he has control over various agencies in the city, fire department, police, and these agencies can be used to send inspections to opposition members, people that you might want to kind of put pressure on, permits, licensing, schools and hospitals under the authority of the city that could be pressured to deliver the vote when needed because they're dependent on city resources. Employees and relatives and friends of people employed by city structures. You can go to ties that were through his political party, the Fatherland All Russia bloc. This included a lot of people who were tied together through old Communist Youth League networks and other connections from his at different points of his life. He also had a lot of economic relationships. So a friend and actually a brother-in-law, Yevtushenkov, was the head of this big firm, Sistema, that had a lot of the business in Moscow. And so it worked in close cooperation with the Moscow mayor's office. And so held a lot of the property and therefore was able to work as part of this larger political machine. And the city of Moscow itself also was able to form economic relationships with lots of other regions in Russia, just because Moscow held a lot of authority. And then you can tie in Lushkov's wife, Elena Baturina, who is at the time Russia's richest woman, I believe, and the head of a billion-dollar firm. And all of its business partners, employees, and clients, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see that this kind of network can be very, very powerful. Oh, and I didn't even mention its media outlet, TV Center, which was one of the 4 big channels in Russia that most people in Russia could watch. So this was a formidable network held together largely through these interpersonal connections that was able to mobilize as a unit, even though they come from all kinds of different formal organizations in support of Luzhkov's presidential bid in 1999-2000. Of course, he lost, but it was still just as an illustration of the kind of network that I have in mind. So a second and third implication are that these networks, like Luzhkov's and all kinds of other different ones, oligarchs, what have you, need direct and personal access to power in order to survive and thrive. Because in a society where it's not just that connections are significant, but connections are highly determinative of your life chances, these networks cannot rely on courts or the rule of law to protect them if they fall out of favor with the people in power. So what you need is you need to establish some kind of good relationship with the people in power, either a neutral relationship, but better yet, you have better protection if you actually have some kind of deal struck with the authorities. And so basically, this desire for a personal connection to power becomes imperative. Another imperative is to be on the winning side of struggles for power when they occur. I should probably correct this a little bit to say, at least you don't want to be on the losing side of a struggle for power. So you might not need to win, but at least you need to be on the side of the winners. Because if you lose, then you suddenly become on the chopping block. And so you become subject to, or you become very vulnerable to having your assets seized by the winning side. Because again, you can't rely on courts or rule of law or other things to protect you effectively. So it becomes pretty much as important to, or even more important, to figure out who will win and make accommodation with that person than it becomes to find out who agrees with you. And so again, this is why, for example, some of Russia's biggest oligarchs, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, people from his organization were contributing to the Communist Party effort for the presidency in the 1990s, along with that of the pro-market forces. Partly because he wanted to kind of hedge his bets, or the people in his organization wanted to hedge their bets in case the communists actually won. So 2 more implications are, because each network, if you have a bunch of different networks of this type in society, each one has its own resources. Kind of what it means is that which side actually wins depends on which side individual networks support. So if you're the head of a network, and you're not powerful enough just to win on your own, you might have the power to tip the balance between one network or other. And so what this means is that it might not just be a question of saying, okay, I think that patron is the most powerful, so I'm going to make accommodation with that person. You might have the power to make that person the patron, or you might have the power to make that person the patron. Or those people might be able to get together without you, or they may be able to get together and make you the patron. And so what this means is that kind of the power dynamics here are in part a kind of game of coordination. And so it's a politics of coordination, networks trying to coordinate their activities in ways that kind of determine a lot of the dynamics in paternalistic politics. So just as I kind of mentioned here, I think which side you back in a struggle partly depends on which side you think other networks will back. Because if you think other networks are all going to get together and do something anyway, and that's going to be enough to win, you want to be part of that. But which side other networks will back depend on which side you back. So again, this coordination becomes really, really important. And so the last couple implications that I'll mention before getting into some of the substance is, first of all, that factors that can disrupt coordination among these elite networks, these kind of paternalistic networks, tend to promote political openness. Because if the elites can't really well coordinate on any single authority, can't agree on who's likely to be the most powerful in the future, or can't find some kind of accommodation of interest between them, there's going to be an ongoing competition among these networks, and it's going to be hard for any one to squelch the others. And so you're likely to have this kind of ongoing political ferment. And so factors that can disrupt political coordination in these societies are, of course, succession crises, when it's not quite clear, like at any given moment when there's one patron in power, okay, obviously that person is in power. But what happens once that person is gone? That might not be clear. Losses in war can also disrupt coordination because it discredits the incumbent power. There might appear new focal points for coordination, so alternatives to the chief patron that might somehow arise externally or internally. Factors that promote coordination, however, tend to promote political closure. So one way, for example, that the Russian system managed to minimize, certainly not eliminate, problems of succession was through the dynastic principle associated with the monarchy. Because at least you would limit the set of possible power contenders, or realistic power contenders, to a certain set. So they'd fight among themselves, and sometimes you'd fight over who was eligible, but a lot of people were ruled out. And so that simplified the process and made it much easier for the Tsarist regime to survive over long periods of time these succession crises that might occur when a Tsar died. Strong ruling parties can also play this role. So in the Soviet Union, I think this had a large a role in keeping the Soviet Union stable, although succession was still a problem for it because it didn't really have the succession process itself institutionalized. China may be a better example of a system that has a succession process in place that kind of helps it survive for a long period of time. So I said I'd talk just very briefly about kind of how all this plays out in Russian history, kind of as an example. And so basically you can think about the Tsarist regime surviving for a long time, I think partly because there's no democracy, at least not much to speak of, and you had this dynastic principle established. So how did it collapse? Well, I think one of the things that shook it, of course, was World War I, and the losses that it was incurring in World War I, which basically led to a loss of faith in the future of the Tsarist regime. It wasn't clear how this regime was going to survive in the longer run, and so you saw soldiers defecting from the front, and basically kind of the collapse of the regime from inside. Eventually, in the power vacuum that followed, you had the Bolsheviks take power. And in the book, I talk about the Bolsheviks as actually a kind of anti-patronalist movement, because they were opposed to the corruption that they associated with the old regime and associated with Tsarism in particular and its elite politics and its its kind of dynastic principles, its very undemocratic nature. And I think there was a genuine attempt there to try and restructure politics on a more formalized grounds, right? Certain criteria were to matter more than individual connections. Whether you had a proletarian background, like a working class background, organizational parties. I mean, that was one of Lenin's main things, was to have like a very strongly centralized, organized party. But in the end, patronalism survived it largely, I think, because of thanks to Stalin. Because basically, if you go back and kind of look at some of the debates that were had by Bolsheviks, the earlier Bolsheviks, people like, even Trotsky and Bukharin, I mean, they were debating these different ideas about how socialism should structure and should be structured. And so they were debating kind of one way versus the other. Whereas Stalin eventually kind of came in and says, okay, I'm just going to build my political machine. And so he initially had this position, which was seen as kind of a minor position in the Bolshevik larger scheme of things, as organizational secretary, which my old professor Jerry Huff used to call a essentially human resources department head in the Communist Party. He wasn't considered one of the big players originally. I mean, he was a big guy, but not compared to the Trotsky or Bukharin, who were kind of the more dynamic figures. But he used his power of appointments to appoint people who he expected to be loyal to him. And so each time when there was a battle, he was able to mobilize these people and gradually take down one by one different opponents until he won. And then this sort of restored the patronalistic nature of the regime, which I then think continued to define the Soviet and generally communist practice up until 1991. And so why did it collapse in 1991? Well, I think there too, I mean, it had solved to some extent, the problems of instability and the cycling by being not democratic and having an institutionalized party that kept things in line. But Gorbachev actively dismantled these very things and actually called for there to be more competition. Moreover, he democratized the Soviet Union in a way that created a natural alternative to himself as the key authority figure, and that was democratizing Russia as a single unit within the Soviet Union. So suddenly you had one republic that contained more than half of the Union's population. You had a government representing that unit, and that became eventually President Boris Yeltsin, who then just naturally was an alternative possible focal point, and so for other elites trying to figure out where to align their interests. And so basically this kind of dual power situation led to uncertainty about who was going to be powerful in the future, combined with Gorbachev's own reforms and own calling for uncertainty, ultimately leading the whole system to collapse again. So I mentioned elections. Elections can both complicate and support the kind of coordination that we would need to see, the kind of coordination among these networks that I think underpins authoritarianism in the post-Soviet world. And so on one hand, an official election result becomes the key expression of dominance. Because once you introduce this principle and you allow at least some competition, the authorities, in order to stay in power, need to manufacture or somehow produce an actual election result that sanctifies the winner. And so this means then that the networks are kind of forced into the situation of struggling to obtain that particular kind of election result. And so what this means is, I think that when you have elections and competitive elections in highly paternalistic societies, it's almost always messy and corrupt. Paternalistic countries are rarely ever considered fully liberal democracies. Instead, it tends to more resemble battles of political machines. And so I think this is why we tend to see a lot of the world having like hybrid regimes, as I've called them, that combine elements of democracy and autocracy, because they're illiberal. They're not fully liberal. They involve manipulation, buying of media coverage, illicitly under the table transfers of resources, all these other things designed to try and help produce the needed election result. But at the same time, even where the incumbents have a significant advantage in manipulating all of these different kinds of resources, they still do get an edge from having actual public support. So by focusing on all these kind of elite battles, I'm not saying that public opinion doesn't matter. In fact, when you introduce elections into the situation, and arguably to some extent even if you don't, it just becomes easier to win these struggles if you have public support. If you have public support, it becomes one of the weapons that you can use against your rivals, because it's harder to falsify results if you actually don't have public support, and it's easier just to get people to vote your way. If you have public support, you can bring your supporters out into the street, and if it's not just that you're paying them and they actually care about you, they're going to be more likely to fight for your cause. So public support matters in trying to manufacture even a election result. And so that's elections. And then the other part of the argument here, which I think all helps us understand where things are going in the former Soviet space, is has constitutions in mind. And so the argument is that presidentialist constitutions tend to promote the coordination of these networks. And so I think that by coordination, I'm talking about the kind of coordination that makes a regime look much more open. So if we imagine a very simple paternalistic world where these kind of lines and dots represent networks, say you have two roughly equal kind of pyramids of power, people deciding which one to join aren't going to be clear on which one is going to be more profitable to join, right? Because it's not clear which one of these two would win. They have roughly equal chances. We assume there's no prior constitution. And so basically this is kind of a sustainable competition. But if we introduce a presidentialist constitution to that situation, what this does is basically creates a single post that symbolizes power that only one network can possibly occupy at a time, because only one person can be president. And so what this does is, first of all, it makes it desirable to have this post, so it creates a competition, sort of winner-take-all. And once you get it, it signals that you're the more powerful person. That's one reason they want it. And even if initially upon getting the presidency, you're not any more powerful than anyone else, all other things equal, just the symbolism of having control over that post is likely to make people over time gradually, if you have to choose which one to join, and there's no other difference, well, I'll just go with the presidential one. So I think the symbolism sort of has that power. And so over time, it gives these networks incentive to coordinate around the presidency. And so eventually we get these people that were formerly neutrals, kind of small networks or individuals deciding to join the network of the presidency. And the result is they all kind of conglomerate into this type of system that I've called a single pyramid system, which tends to have high degrees of political closure and is more authoritarianism. And so basically what we're getting then is the authoritarianism that we see in a lot of the former Soviet countries, including Russia, is, I think, this kind of single pyramid system type of arrangement where there are lots of different networks involved, and they've gradually coordinated their authority around the president. The president has encouraged this in various different ways. And it pretty much leaves smaller networks in society, the choice of either joining or being squelched, because they don't have any opportunity of really making a go of it themselves. And so in this kind of situation, it tends to greatly resemble authoritarianism, because even if the president of the country doesn't order the opposition to be repressed, these different networks that have the resources are not going to want to contribute to opposition politics. They might not want to even give a theater hall to an opposition candidate to hold a rally. So even if you're not directly repressed by orders of the president, you can still find it very, very difficult to operate. You're not going to get media time. You're not going to have a lot of things go your way if you're in the opposition. So kind of the point of all this, to some degree, is to say that the 1990s, I think, can be understood as a history of single pyramid systems emerging in the former Soviet Union. And so it's a history by which, when Gorbachev basically disrupted the old political equilibrium, and in all these former Soviet states, you had complete uncertainty as to what the nature of power even was, how was power going to be organized in the new era. But they still had their personal connections. And they still knew the importance of friendship, and it became even more important, arguably, during the times of economic crises, where you had to depend on friend networks in order to get goods and resources. Initially, there's this period of disruption, right? It was almost like chaos. The leaders didn't really know how to manage things, and the people on the ground didn't really know. So it was open competition. It was this feeling of freedom. But over time, either because leaders learned how to practice this sort of politics, or the ones who didn't learn got replaced, pretty much all 12 high patronalisms, so that's basically not the Baltic states, former Soviet states, wound up, first of all, with presidentialist constitutions. And then all but one of them then developed this form of patronal presidentialism. And the only exception, I think, is Moldova, where you had a competition for power, but that was the one case where the parliament actually won. And so in all the other cases, you had battles for power. The parliament resisted Boris Yeltsin in 1993, and even before that, Yeltsin's solution ultimately was to bring the tanks in and once and for all quell the parliament and establish Russia as a presidentialist state that was dominated by the president. And ever since then, you've seen this tendency towards the consolidation of a single pyramid system. Whereas in Moldova, the parliament happened to win, and so the parliament then took the action of eliminating direct elections for the president and making the president elected within the parliament. Basically the parliament got power. But at the same time, because of the problem of succession and the need for coordinated expectations to exist about the future in order to underpin the stability of these regimes, their apparent stability can vanish once expectations, anticipation starts to arise about the leader departing. And that is, the leader essentially becomes a lame duck. And what that means is that basically if you're a network in the system and, okay, you recognize the leader X, chief patron, is in power now, have to do everything he tells me to do. But then suddenly you realize, okay, in a period of 2 years, for some reason, that person is likely to leave office. So suddenly you have to start thinking, okay, well what's, he may give me an order now, but that really is only good for the next 2 years. I want to survive long into the future. So you need to start thinking around about who's going to be in power after that leader. And if you really don't trust anyone else out there, maybe you need to start thinking about doing things to make sure you're the leader. Or at least to make sure that the worst enemy of yours is not the next leader. So it's just the classic succession problem, but kind of magnified by this system. So once these expectations of leadership departure start to emerge, kind of get on the table, the regimes become very fragile. And these networks start jockeying for position to protect their interests or expand their interests if they think that they're capable of doing so. So this competition, I think, is certainly more than enough to contribute to the breaking up of these networks. The typical result, I think, is not that the collapse of these regimes means you get democracy. It's not democratization, even though a lot of times you get a revolution, and it looks like democratization. The leader's overthrown. The opponents are saying, we did this in the name of democracy. Looks like democratization, but typically the result, in fact, is something of the reverse. And I should say that kind of when these struggles break out, I kind of skipped over that line there, public opinion plays a huge role in influencing who wins these struggles once they break out. So they look like democratization when you get a collapse, partly because you see the authority of a leader decline, partly because public opinion influences which network wins the succession struggle. But then once that new network is in place, all the incentives are there for the same thing to happen all over again, unless you get a new kind of constitution. So this is why I said before that cycles can be regular or irregular depending on sources of expectations on succession. They can be irregular because succession crises often arise for irregular reasons. A leader can fall into ill health, can make just stupid moves, right, that undercut the sense among other networks or even the broad public that the leader is fit for office. You can have exogenous shocks, like a defeat in a war. So if a leader leads a country into an ill-advised war, loses badly, you can undermine that leader's authority. So that's why in some points these kind of periods of openness that are punctuated by lame duck periods occur irregularly. But they can also occur regularly to some degree. When term limits are on the books, they automatically provide a kind of focal point for people who start thinking about the future. And so if you're a leader and you're limited by the Constitution to 2 terms, for whatever reason you haven't been able to change that or haven't moved to change that, so as long as that's on the books, people around you are going to start thinking about, well, maybe that time is when that patron is going to leave office. And so that kind of keeps this issue of succession on the table and becomes more and more acute the closer that moment of succession comes. Sometimes leaders just decide not to run. It happens. We don't think about that happening often, but they have the legal right to. They're in good health, and they decide not to run. Other times they might not have term limits. They might want to continue running. They might actually continue running, but they just become too old to be seen as credible leaders by a substantial part of the population or in the early 1990s, we saw these irregular regime cycles dominate. So, if you look back at like the early Soviet history, it was just a history of like president after president getting overthrown. Some cases more than once. So you had all these flameouts. Zviad Gamsahurdia in Georgia, really tried to institute an authoritarian nationalist regime very quickly. Quickly led to revolts by people within the country, led to a civil war. He was eventually killed. Tajikistan, you saw something similar, sort of some massive blunders that the Nabiyev made in like arming certain people to defend him, which led to a civil war again, and he wound up dying as well in the early 1990s. Azerbaijan, you saw a couple failed presidents in a row. So you saw a lot of these in the early failures when a lot of this was uncertain, when people were uncertain about kind of what power was and how it was to be arranged. But eventually, these leaders learned. And since maybe it doesn't exactly date temporally, but basically since the mid-90s. And so what I define it as is, once the initial single pyramid system was set up in a country, the ousters of individual leaders becomes much more predictable. So if we look at all 12 leaders, patronal presidents in patronal presidential countries since that time, and that's up through 2016, 9 out of the 12 of them have been both unpopular and lame ducks. And this includes, and here I'm including not just former Soviet kind of recognized states, but also the unrecognized states. And if you take only the recognized states, actually there's only one exception, which I'll mention in a minute. So if we go to term limits, basically when the following leaders were overthrown, Levon Petrosyan in Armenia in 96, Eduard Shevardnadze in the Rose Revolution in 2003, Artzimba, who's the leader of Abkhazia, was actually overthrown in a similar kind of revolution in 2004, 2005. The Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, Akayev in 2005. Bakiyev, who was overthrown in Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Eduard Kakoity, even in kind of the supposedly Russian dependency of South Ossetia in 2012. And Mikhail Saakashvili in 2012-13. When they were ousted from power, they were all in this kind of situation. So if we take like the Georgian example, which is often seen through the Rose Revolution as a kind of people power, we look at exactly kind of what happened during this process. Basically, Shevardnadze won re-election in 2000, but then announced, and he entered his constitutionally final term, but then he announced that he was not going to seek re-election. And so there was even a report by the TASS news agency, which wrote shortly after that, that announcement resounded like a gong among the Georgian elites. It is time to prepare. And it was shortly after that that Shevardnadze's justice minister, Mikhail Saakashvili, resigned from Shevardnadze's government, as did a bunch of other people who had been associated with Shevardnadze's ruling party or government. They formed the core of the new opposition. So again, these are other people with their own networks breaking with the regime that had once been part of it after succession came strongly onto the table, mobilized support. Shevardnadze was very unpopular at the time, and the opposition wound up winning. And so you can tell similar stories for each of these cases. Leonid Kuchma in 2004 had the opportunity to run legally, but chose not to do so, trying to usher into office Viktor Yanukovych. And at this time, Kuchma's popularity was extremely low. Yanukovych had some support in his regional base, but not much. And so the result of that was the Orange Revolution. And Shevardnadze and Igor Smirnov from Transnistria, or the PMR, were over 70 when they were ousted. So if we look at the recognized post-Soviet states, Yanukovych in the Euromaidan Revolution in 2014 is the only instance of a patronal president of the type that I've described here, representing a single pyramid system, to have been overthrown when he wasn't a lame duck. He was only in his first term of office. He was extremely unpopular at the time. And one can make a good argument that the reason he got overthrown was that he just made a series of incredibly bad political decisions, inflaming the protests, which originally probably would have died out had he not started to aggressively apply violence against the protesters, and therefore turn what had been protests against the European agreement that he probably could have negotiated with into protests against him and what was seen as his illegitimacy. So all of this is not to say that you can't get any kind of competition when, that basically, wherever you get a lame duck syndrome, the authoritarian loses. If the authoritarian team manages to win a good degree of popular support, it can survive these struggles. So Yeltsin was incredibly unpopular in 1999. That's one of the reasons that Moscow Mayor Luzhkov, who I talked about earlier, was able actually to become one of the favorites, either for him or his ally Yevgeny Primakov, to become president in the summer of '99. But what changed this was Vladimir Putin being appointed prime minister, who was initially nothing in the ratings, and people kind of thought, well, when Yeltsin endorsed him, this was the kiss of death. But then you had the apartment bombings in Chechnya of mysterious origin, and Putin as prime minister then ordering Russian troops to move into Chechnya, and you track his opinion poll results in the presidential race throughout the fall of '99, and in the matter of October, November, and December, already by December he was up to over 50% support in the presidential race. And once he reached that 50%, it's at that point that you started to see Luzhkov's coalition fall apart. His core people still supported him, but other people started to defect towards Putin's side. And so already by March, what had looked like a very close contest at best for the Kremlin turned into a landslide victory that looked like it didn't really involve much competition at all. You can see something kind of similar in Azerbaijan in 2003, where the elder Haydar Aliyev was dying, managed to usher into power his son Ilham, largely on the basis of his own authority as kind of the savior of Azerbaijan, having rescued it from state collapse. And Armenia in 2008, you also had a presidential team, president going into a lame duck period, but had a good degree of public support, so was able to hand off power to a successor. But in all of these cases, again, whether or not the incumbent team won or the opposition, and even in opposition cases where we all thought they were Democrats, Saakashvili had trained in the United States, right, was seen as, Oscar Akayev was seen when he was initially in power as Central Asia's lone democratic hope. Edward Shevardnadze, before he was president of Georgia, was the pro-democracy foreign minister and Politburo member of Gorbachev's Soviet Union, who ended the Cold War, warned Gorbachev against a hardline authoritarian coup. These were all people that were thought to be Democrats. They all wound up behaving kind of the same sort of authoritarian way once they were in power. So I think these kind of dynamics have a strong pull that can overcome a lot of personality types and a lot of personal convictions that might actually be pro-democracy. So I won't go into a lot here because I want to wrap up and have discussion, but basically if the question is how to escape the cycling, what I mentioned before was factors that promote coordination of these elite networks around a single patron tend to reinforce a more authoritarian direction. So a presidentialist constitution, by basically enshrining the symbolism of a single leader of the nation, does that. So what about constitutions that don't do that? I've called these constitutions divided executive constitutions, where you have a president who's directly elected on one hand, but then on the other hand you have a prime minister who is not directly elected by the population, but is beholden primarily to an elected parliament, who is not primarily dependent on the president. So it's not cases where the president appoints the prime minister, which makes the prime minister a secondary figure, but places basically where the result of a parliamentary election determines who the prime minister is. And if they have roughly equal executive powers, this tends to coordinate, or to complicate the coordination of these networks, because suddenly it's not obvious who the most powerful figure is going to be in the country. At least if you have two different networks controlling these two different posts. And so this starts to create space. So if you're a business person and you don't like what the president is offering you, you can break with the president and go over to the prime minister. The prime minister is likely to say, sure, come onto my side, I'll give you a good deal, because they want you as an ally and they want to weaken the president. And people can do it the other way around. So this starts to create a lot of openness. And so again, this creates this situation of a competing pyramid system, where it's not clear who's going to dominate, and people can go back and forth, and it tends to be relatively open. It can even be quite democratic, but again, it's a highly corrupt form of democracy. And so a lot of people wouldn't even call it democracy because they consider it so corrupt. So in Ukraine, after the Orange Revolution, this is essentially what you got. And so people thought, well, it's a lot more open now, but the government can't do anything because there's a constant battles between whoever's prime minister and the president and other networks. So if we look at the set of countries that have had these divided executive constitutions in the former Soviet Union, we find, since at least the early 90s, that these are consistently the most democratic countries in the former Soviet space. So again, I mentioned Ukraine, 2005 to 2010. Highly corrupt, ineffective government, but democratic. This, was, in fact, was the only time where a former Soviet country other than the Baltics was rated fully free by Freedom House. Kyrgyzstan, since 2010, adopted this kind of constitution. That was after the revolution that overthrew President Bakiyev. Again, it was a state on the verge of state collapse and involving kind of ethnic pogroms. But now you see it's kind of sustained a much more open process. I mean, they've actually just instituted a new constitutional change, which is shifting power to the prime minister. So I need to kind of do more research to kind of figure out how far that's gone. But at least up until now, Kyrgyzstan has had that system. One of the reasons I think Saakashvili fell was in 2010. He instituted a constitutional change that weakened the powers of the presidency and transferred them to the prime minister, effectively creating a divided executive constitution. A lot of people think that he was trying to kind of create a prime ministership that he could then occupy to stay in power after his term limit was up. But whatever his intentions, basically this turned him into a lame duck and undercut his authority at home. And so he lost power before even being able to do that. And Ukraine, after the Euromaidan revolution, adopted the same constitution that had been there after the Orange Revolution. And again, it's been a much more openly competitive system since then. But again, not something that people would call an ideal democracy at all because of the role of corruption. Elsewhere in the world, you can point to cases like Bulgaria and Macedonia. Okay, well, they're in the European Union, so there are a lot of other reasons that they could be a little more democratic. And it's like if you compare, but if you compare Bulgaria, for example, to Romania, which has a different political system, Bulgaria looks all right. But I think one of the more interesting cases is Mongolia, which has had a pretty democratic system despite being in what one could argue is the worst democratic neighborhood possible, sandwiched between Russia and China. So how do you explain that? Like, and I think that this kind of constitution has something to do with that. And these have all been substantially more open than presidentialist countries, and including presidentialist periods in their own countries. So the periods when Ukraine had a presidentialist constitution, there was always this continued drift towards a more presidentialist power that's been much more difficult for any president to do with the divided executive constitution. So it's not to say these constitutions are like unbreakable supports for one system or other. They can be overcome. Historical circumstance can change them. In the right moment, a leader can change them. But they try to change them because they matter. And I think that's why you see this kind of pattern. And the other thing you find that you don't find in the parliamentary or the kind of divided executive constitutions is that under presidentialist constitutions, when you find these revolutions, they're almost always followed by a new round of political closure, not the kind of ongoing openness that we see in these other countries when they've tried them. So again, thinking about the future, I said it was predictable. It does make us think that countries that have this divided executive constitution, right? One prediction would be they're more likely to stay democratic in the future. So Georgia, probably Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, first and foremost. Moldova also recently reinstituted a directly elected presidency, but the presidency has very weak executive powers. So it may actually be something more like a divided executive constitution. Places where revolution is most likely, well, those would be places that we would consider have leaders that may be becoming lame ducks for one reason or another and are unpopular. Right now, there are not a whole lot of those on the horizon. Tajikistan maybe as Rahmon ages. And then we have to think about places where revolution may be possible, but something significant would have to change in terms of of public opinion. So places where you have leaders who are potentially becoming lame ducks, but have a lot of public support, possibly enough to kind of weather a succession crisis. Like Kazakhstan, where Nazarbayev is over 70, but is highly, highly popular. And so, he has a possibility of controlling a succession process. And Armenia arguably is something similar. So what does this mean with Russia? Possibility of a new Russian revolution? I definitely don't think one is going to happen in 2017. I don't think one will happen again in 2018 either, which is when the next Russian presidential election is scheduled, because Putin is in the first of 2 consecutive terms that he's currently allowed. But I do think after he wins the re-election in 2018, which I think he'll do based on this kind of logic, things start to get interesting. Because suddenly this issue of succession starts to come up again. He lengthened, or he together with Dmitry Medvedev, his kind of protege when he was president temporarily, lengthened presidential terms to 6 years. So now Putin will have 6 years after 2018 to formally be able to stay in power. But at some point, the elites around him, if the term limits are not removed, are going to increasingly think about how what they're going to do about the future. And there's going to be some kind of jockeying for power. And if Putin remains highly popular, my guess is he'll be able to control the whole process, just like he did in letting Medvedev be president temporarily while he was prime minister. But if he becomes a lot less popular, I think suddenly his ability to control the process, which looks so strong today, could actually evaporate fairly quickly, and probably significantly in advance of 2024, which would be the next presidential elections. And so one potential flashpoint would be parliamentary elections, which would be scheduled for 2021. So it's a bit ahead of the presidential election, but it could be seen as kind of a test of strength for these different networks competing to influence the presidential election. But again, all these things are very hard to predict, but at least there does seem to be some regularity. I can talk about it later, but I mean, it even does show up in some statistical analysis that I've done. So at least thinking about the future, this is where I would think kind of the danger points for the stability in Russia would be. So I don't think they have anything to worry about now, but kind of moving forward, if they don't kind of maintain public support somehow, I think there's a danger. So let me wrap up there. I've talked a little more than I wanted to, but thank you for your attention. And I'll be happy to talk about kind of anything related to this or Russia generally, or even other countries that you might like to talk about. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation, this lecture. And now the floor is yours for questions. Guys, please.
What could you tell us about Uzbekistan, where a new president has been elected recently?
Yeah, so, yeah.
Maybe we start with this question, then I will look around how many people raise their hand, and maybe then we collect.
Yeah, so Uzbekistan is one of 2 cases with Turkmenistan where increasingly Tajikistan is drifting in that direction, where you don't actually have competitive elections at all. And so by competitive election, I define that as allowing at least some real opposition to compete. And so, Russia, I think, does that by allowing, Communist Party candidate, for example, to regularly compete, Yablika. Whereas Uzbekistan, it's all pretty much just shills of the regime, if you put it that way, who are competing for these powers. And so I think that changes the succession dynamics a little bit, like the other instance where you had in Turkmenistan of a very similar kind of regime, which I would call like a complete dictatorship. There's nothing hybrid there. Had a similar outcome where you had the leader die, then there was a little behind-the-scenes shuffle, and suddenly one person emerged. Turkmenistan is actually a little more surprising because the person who emerged was, basically sort of like the dentist of the dictator, if you put it that way, and hadn't been seen as a major player from outside. And the people that were constitutionally in line were quickly sort of shuffled out. Whereas in Uzbekistan, the power struggles seem to take place in anticipation, again, behind the scenes, not through any kind of electoral dynamic and nothing even in the streets. but there was this struggle of networks. And so, the struggle largely appears to have been, between the guy who won and his daughter Gulnara, who interestingly enough lost despite her familial connection, with her father. And so, just kind of shows that the family connection doesn't necessarily always help you out. But again, Uzbekistan is so closed. It's just hard for me to know. I don't have any direct insight into, precisely why, Azimov won and why Gulnara lost. One can speculate a lot. She was having a lot of public opinion, or at least kind of public relations problems related to corruption allegations. Was just kind of her personality and style didn't seem to mesh with sort of, Uzbek culture as the kind of patriarchal leadership seemed to define it. I'm interested in all analysis on this, so if people have views on that, I'm interested. But I think you did see a secession struggle that was brewing, but I think it kind of largely had been resolved by the time, Islam Karimov, the longtime president, had died. But partly because I think it was anticipated. I mean, there were long, many years, kind of rumors about his health and how he was doing.
No, I've seen Gwendolyn Sasse. It's a great pleasure that I can do what I've missed to welcome Professor Gwendolyn Sasse. She is the Director of Choice of the Center for East European and International Studies, actually our collaboration partner for this lecture series. Very welcome again, and your question.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to support such a wonderful lecture series, and thanks for your great talk, Henry. I was wondering if I could ask you two questions really, or related questions, and if you could expand a little bit on why some networks succeed and others don't. I mean, you gave that Lushkov example, and the structure, the composition of these networks always seems to involve a mixture of business, media, political state positions, and so on. And having a partner in an important position seems to help too. But what is it then that makes some members of this network defect and go over to another network? What's your views on when does it work and when doesn't it work? You mentioned public opinion in that respect, but maybe there must be other things too. And the second thing, partly related to this, is you said a lot of really interesting things about the composition of networks and how they change and adapt. And I was wondering if you also looked in more detail at how the networks are built in the first place. So most of what you're talking about, I think, is about rebuilding networks and or maintaining them. But I think we know probably still less about how they're built in the first place. Thank you very much.
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think really fundamental ones. They're kind of linked, right? So the kind of how the networks are formed and how they stay together. I guess kind of the way I see it is that if we take individuals, right, they have personal relationships with lots of different people, and some of those relationships involve greater degrees of kind of investment than others. So kind of take, so if you have like a family member, you're going to have a very deep investment in that relationship, which doesn't mean it's unbreakable, as the Gulnara-Karimova case shows, but at least it means that that's going to be a very high value relationship for you. It's going to be hard for you, not only, costly for you not only to break, but impossible for you to break in certain senses just because you're associated by others, right, as being likely to behave, in relationship with that person, right? People are going to wonder, well, okay, has this person really broken with their family? And it's going to be skeptical. So it's both costly for you to remove, but also reputationally harder to gain credibility by making a shift. And so I think that's kind of like one extreme where I think people at the individual level are kind of like least likely to break these ties and for the networks to stay together. And then you have a lot of other types of relationships that form over different periods of time and involve different levels of investment. So in some cases in the post-Soviet world, sort of you have this phenomenon of odnokashniki, sort of people who eat from the same trough, I think literally, and basically these are your classmates, odnoklasniki, it's a kind of a pun on that. And these are kind of tight study groups that form in school or different universities, and the students work very tightly and closely together, and these often go on to form very important networks later on for the future. And so like these things where people regularly interact and have these kind of close relationships. So that's kind of an intermediate form. And then maybe later, I mean, you can have just very simple transactional relationships where people come together for a business purpose, then establish that personal tie, and then gradually, forms, or, some kind of thing that, some kind of political deal that's just mutually useful, that brings two people that didn't know each other necessarily well, but then through repetitive action, you start to develop a connection between people. So these networks are inherently dynamic, but I'd say that last category is probably the most fragile. So I think it's just a variety of different types of ways that these things can form. And of course, it depends on structure. In Central Asia, while I don't think that the networks that we talk about there as clans are really primarily kinship organizations, I think there is a certain kinship core there to a lot of them that you wouldn't see in the same way, in places like Moldova, or Russia or Ukraine. Even though kinship matters, but there's just a different sense of extended family, and the size of families is different, at least in modern kind of historical times. I think kind of just in the abstract, I think these are some of the ways that like networks form, kind of at the personal level, at the micro level. And then, if we're talking about kind of like how do they rise to the stratosphere and become like powerful, and which ones succeed? That's a really interesting question. I haven't really given a whole lot of thought, precisely to that question, because I'm kind of looking at them once they reach a certain level. If I think of just some of the networks that succeed, a lot of times it's very arbitrary, random ways, like where people happen to be at the moment of transition. So I think like in the post-Soviet case, it was this moment with the old system, which kind of gave people a certain sense of certainty about how politics works, right? What you needed to do to succeed in politics was pretty clear in the Brezhnev era, more or less, and people kind of knew how power worked. But then suddenly everything was off the table. But a lot of things became possible. So, if you're somebody like, Berezovsky, who's like, or other, people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who happened to be like in the Communist Youth League at the time when everything was starting to collapse, you started to find yourself with opportunities to sort of privatize resources, first informally and then formally. Some people found themselves in the right positions to gain resources of the former state on a massive scale. So there wasn't necessarily anything unique to their networks. I mean, the Komsomol positioning helped, but it was just kind of them being at the right place at the right time, seeing the opportunity, being entrepreneurial, and then kind of being able to turn that into something large. But again, that's just kind of one set of examples of like kind of the oligarchs, how they were able to get powerful. So if you look at like regional political machines, there's also some randomness. Not everyone succeeded. If you look at Russia as well, done some analysis of which regional machine politicians were the best able to build up their bases of support. And so if you were like the leader of an agricultural region, for example, or one that had strong agricultural bases, you were better able to manipulate collective farms, which would give you a core of vote, which then you could translate into power at the regional level. Communist background actually didn't help you in the post-Soviet period, but being in the ethnic republics did. The ethnic republics tended to be a little more authoritarian than the others, and so again, that may have to do with the fact that the republics had a stronger set of Soviet-era state institutions. I'm talking about like autonomous republics, not the union republics, that could be used entrepreneurially to sort of develop control over your region. But again, it meant like I think a lot of this, I guess, just kind of thinking through this as we talk, had to do with where you were at the point of transition, with what Georgy Derlugin has called kind of what your own personal capital was at that moment of transition, what kind of resources you had, whether it was credibility as a nationalist or positioning in the Communist Party Youth League, access to some other form of resource, and then what you did with it. And what you did with it could be very, very contingent. So I do think, especially at the beginning, there was just a high degree of contingency as to kind of how things developed. And then kind of beyond that, it's just a matter of kind of natural selection, which ones seem to be the better at it. But at least that's how I'd venture, not entirely briefly, some initial thoughts on that, but that's a great question. Great question, thanks.
I've seen one question. Maybe you introduce yourself quickly.
My name is Blankenagel. I'm from Hamburg University. So I have a question concerning the changes in Russia at the very top. We have had a new leader of the presidential administration. We have Kirienko moving in there. We have certain spectacular go-aways like Yakunin. We have this very strange Ulukayev affair where we don't know, he cannot have been so stupid as to oppose to Sechin. So the interesting question is also if we look at the new people coming in and also at the people which are already in the presidential administration, it is not those sort of social circus where usually Putin recruited his people from. It's very many people from the GIMO especially. So do we have a sort of change of elites, and if we do have this, what does it actually mean? Is it something sort of already oriented to the elections in 2018? So what's your opinion?
Yeah, another great question. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice kind of simple answer to it. I think like some of these changes you can explain by looking back to some of the earlier battles. I mean, some of the elites that were sort of pushed out, people like Ulukayev or Yevtushenkov or others that were sort of marginalized. These were people that had some ties to kind of the alternative political forces of the 1990s, sort of the pre-Putin era. But then again, the appointment of Kirienko, he would be right in that category, and so to make him head of the presidential administration doesn't exactly fit that model. So I do see a general trend towards still pushing out some of the earlier people, but then it's not consistently so. Sergei Shoigu, again, defense minister, right? I mean, he's one of the original Yeltsin ministers, and he's still in there doing some of this work. Yakunin to me is still a mystery, right? I don't have a strong solution to it, except perhaps he was considered to be a credible potential presidential contender at some point. Maybe he was seen as being ambitious, therefore needed to be marginalized. I think they're always thinking ahead to future elections. I can't imagine that Yakunin would have been actually plotting to run then, but he is an ambitious guy, does have a huge network. Certainly Russian railroads, which he had for a long period of time under his control, was a massive asset, stretching all across the country, controlling lots of financial flows. I mean, he has his kind of operations in the world of knowledge, even political science, he's a supporter of. So it may be that on certain individual cases like that, I'm not quite sure. But on the other hand, I think what we do see is, we see we do see some ferment, right? There's some effort to bring in younger people to a lot of these positions. The people in networks are getting older. Some of the older ones are being removed. Putin must realize as he's getting older that to keep the system vibrant and vital, there has to be kind of some new blood. He's been very loyal to most of the people that have been in his administration. I mean, people like Medvedev, everybody keeps wondering when is he going to go? But he's still there. But it doesn't mean that there might not be a few people taken out to send whatever message, for who knows what sin they might have contributed, they might have committed, behind the scenes. So unfortunately, that's about all I can do on that topic. But but I'm sure they're thinking ahead to the future, and it probably has something to do with those things.
Your puzzle started with a great deal of varieties of this dynamics in the post-Soviet area, but when you talked about your practical examples, you usually have the dynamic that once established single pyramid either became even more hierarchical and more singled, or broke down to competing pyramids. But what about another type of dynamic when competing pyramids go back to a single pyramid, more hierarchical one? And here I have an empirical example of Ukraine 2004, 2010, when after having these competing pyramids, we have development back to single pyramid machine. So how can you explain it with your argumentation? And the second question is about clients in this patronal politics. So in your explanation, this is patron who is more proactive and the main figure in these relationships, and clients are only react to his doing or misdoing. But do you also can take into account the possibility of proactive actions of these clients, and under which conditions they can be more active than reactive? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, terrific questions. Maybe I'll just take the last one first, because it's just in mind. Yeah, I think certainly there can be a feedback both ways. My sense is it has to do with the scale of the task at hand. So mostly what I'm talking about here is sort of battles for ultimate power. And so I think when these questions are at stake, the chief patron makes sure to dominate, and usually does, which doesn't mean you're not going to have some defections at lower levels, but my guess is it would be very hard for a lower level person to convince the person at the top to adopt one or other strategy based on their interests. But again, that's only for the very, the competition for the pinnacle of power, which I think is kind of, I talk about that because I think that's driving patterns of large-scale opening and closure of the political system. But on operational questions, yeah, by all means. I mean, I think as we were talking about earlier, right, that one person, the president can't be expected to resolve every single problem. And so it has to delegate to some degree, and that's a large part what kind of a successful president of this system does, is find a way to accommodate different people's interests. And one way that's done is by giving them certain spheres of autonomy, where so long as they don't cross some sort of bounds or red lines that are either expected to be understood or maybe made clear, they do have a good deal of authority to kind of drive policy. One problem, I think, one dysfunctionality in this system for certain kinds of policies is that when it's uncertain where that line is between where your autonomy as a client and your sub-patron, put it that way, and the patron is, right? If you're not sure, then maybe it makes sense for you to kind of bump that decision up or get an okay. And so the greater that uncertainty is, the more likely is you're going to see paralysis in policymaking, because people are just not going to want to, they're going to be afraid to make certain decisions on their own. And so, in Russia, I mean, we've seen that in a number of cases where the president or prime minister is kind of making what would, otherwise be kind of ridiculous type interventions on very minor things that, come up, from below or just are kind of bumped up, or nothing happens until the president makes a decision, even on like kind of whether to develop the forest in Khimki or, something like that, right? A zoning question, why does that go up to the Kremlin? And then the other question, yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly a number of cases where you have a competing pyramid system, or competing pyramid situation, let me put it that way, go back to a single pyramid system. And I think there are kind of two types of scenarios in which that happens. The more common one is where you have a presidentialist single pyramid system, where you have an outbreak of kind of competing pyramid politics, usually related to a succession crisis. So I'd say you had that kind of competition in 99, 2000 in Russia, as well as Rose Revolution and places like that. Regardless of kind of whether the opposition wins, as in the case of Georgia, or the incumbent wins, as in the case of Putin, or the incumbent team wins, you see this new round of closure emerging from that previous competing pyramid system. But the other case, which I think you're more interested in, certainly the case of Ukraine indicates that, is where you had a competing pyramid system, or a situation that was underpinned by a divided executive constitution, which should have been reinforcing it, that was then reversed. So far, like the Ukrainian case, seems to be the main case where that's happened. I mean, partly just because there haven't been that many experiments with the divided executive constitution. What happened in Ukraine? Well, I think, in 2010, which was the key moment, obviously, it illustrates the weaknesses of constitutions. I mean, I think they matter, but they can be overturned. And in this particular case, after the Orange Revolution, you had the introduction of, genuinely free political competition 2010 was judged to be a free and fair, more or less, election. I mean, it's full of, problems and corruption and biased media and things like that, but each side had equal opportunities, right? There wasn't any particular advantage that Tymoshenko had over Yanukovych, and in fact, the incumbent, Yushchenko, lost disastrously, didn't even make it to the runoff. So, Yanukovych won. And, he won by, he was able to win by majority in the, or at least, at least enough to win the election in a runoff, right? So he beat the most powerful other network in a head-to-head contest. And so in that way, he generated very strong expectations that this was the power of the future. And so I think kind of using that moment, he very smartly moved very quickly to effect a change on the constitutional court, which allowed him to invalidate the previous constitutional reform, reinstall the presidentialist constitution. And I think there are a lot of different scenarios one could imagine, contingencies that might have prevented that from happening. I think like if Tymoshenko had been a little more willing to strike a deal with him, for example, or kind of be more accommodating, she might not have lost key supporters, people who I think might have supported her still in parliament, like Vladimir Litvin, the chair of the parliament, who made one of the key decisions to allow the reforms to, I think he could have possibly blocked this change, but didn't. So there are a lot of different contingencies, but I think the key is that one of the problems with democracy is that if you get very, very popular, you can win a very commanding victory, and sometimes you can use that mandate to do undemocratic things. And I think that's kind of what you saw in Ukraine. So it just proves like the Constitution was not like a solid bulwark. I think it was an influence that I think complicated what Yanukovych had to do, but didn't end up stopping him. But in the end, he stopped himself through, I think, a lot of the problems of his administration, were trying to close up power too fast, for, kind of what would be smart politically, and using force against the Euromaidan and what have you. So I think that's kind of how I interpret the Ukrainian case. So it's an exception, but I think one that still makes sense in terms of the logic.
Okay, now we have to correct.
Thanks for your talk, by the way. You placed a lot of emphasis on public opinion, and that was for me most vividly illustrated when you talked about like the rise of Putin and the fall of Yanukovych, and the role that public opinion played in that. And it strikes me that both men have gone to great lengths to sort of demonstrate that they're religious men, and have made a lot of accommodation to the church, the Orthodox Church, in various ways by either proclaiming lavras or rebuilding churches or what have you. And depending on which survey you look at, very often the Orthodox Church comes out as the most trusted, or certainly one of the most trusted institutions in society. And that's why I was surprised that you didn't mention the Orthodox Church as a political actor. And I was wondering if you thought that the church itself had any kind of influence in either facilitating coordination, consolidation of these corollary sort of pyramids of power. And if I could ask just one more sort of related question, given your patronalism and the importance of personal networks, I'm wondering if you would at all link that to this trend, or the emergence of these kind of frozen conflict zones, these sub-state structures that are quasi-independent, whether you're talking about Transnistria, Abkhazia, or Donbass and the like.
Maybe in close round, any further questions? Short ones, please.
Also related to religion, the group that consisted of paternalistic countries. All of them are either Christian Orthodox or Muslim. Do you think that matters? Religion that shapes culture and so on.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, maybe just take the last one, this may be kind of a starting point. I see this dynamic as sort of, what I'm talking about is kind of gets back to the last question as well. I mean, I'm really interested in the very broad scale dynamics. And so I see the broad patterns happening in terms of just kind of these cycles of opening and closure that are sort of modulated by public opinion, punctuated by lame duck periods, as happening, I think, regardless of what the kind of the particulars of the network are and the particulars of the belief structure in the country. At least, so far that's what my research finds. But I do think that, certainly the ways in which this happens, and probably a lot of other smaller scale outcomes in terms of the nature of any particular competitive system, right? I mean, there can be many different kinds of competitive systems, many axes along which competition can take place. I think all of these definitely depend on local conditions, including potentially religion or the distribution of religious or other beliefs in society. In the post-Soviet space, I don't think, we don't see too many places where religion has been very, has been like structuring of the main political battles. And I think partly this gets back to like Russia. In a lot of these places, there's historically been, Ukraine may be an exception there, but like in Russia anyway, there's a historic relationship between the church and the state. I think in principle, if the church ever kind of went rogue and went into opposition, I think that would cause big problems for Putin. But it has a history of accommodating with the authorities. A lot of these people are the same people who have been associated with it for a long time, which isn't to discredit the whole thing. But there's a lot of there are different views about what the relationship between the church and state should be. So I guess I don't expect that to happen. But I think that in terms of mobilizing support, they recognize that, and they haven't. I think even Yeltsin, who certainly didn't give a whole lot of evidence of being religious, would sort of appear on Easter, at a church, and Putin has kind of taken that to another step. But I think after his popularity started to slip with the 2008-2009 financial crisis, then they did start to take this to a much more explicit level of kind of connecting with the people on the basis of values, religious values. So the anti-blasphemy law, which formally isn't just for Orthodox, it's to protect all believers of the main faiths from insult, but that clearly is directed at the majority of Orthodox people who strongly support that law. And so I think that there is a willingness to kind of tap into it. And for the most part, tapping into it has been a kind of a successful political strategy for the regime. You're right. I could have talked about it. I guess I see religion mostly as mattering in this particular case as a possibility for making connections or building public support. It's a form of legitimation that they sometimes use, but it's rarely overtly politicized in terms of the religious distinctions being really drawn. I think with more recent times kind of starting to push in a different direction. Countries like Ukraine are a little different, where you have a divided, the country's divided among different faiths, and they're definitely associated with different religious or different political trends and tendencies, and you even have the Moscow Patriarchate Russian Church in Ukraine. So there, I think that's kind of an exception where these religious lines are significant axes of political contestation. If we go back to Central Asia and Islam, again, I haven't seen a whole lot of research onto this, which I've always thought like religion deserves more treatment than it gets. So far the authorities in like a lot of these predominantly Islamic countries have tried to significantly repress kind of Islamic radicalism. So it's potentially there as an axis of power and potentially a source of opposition mobilization. But it tends to be, Azerbaijan or certainly Uzbekistan, places like that are very careful to try to keep that in check. Did I miss one?
How about the sub-state structures?
Oh, right, yeah. Basically, right, I guess I just very briefly, what I find is that they're part of the, I think these like places like Abkhazia, the breakaway states, they actually tend to follow a lot of these same dynamics. We see them, despite Russian control. So we see a number of cases where Russia was backing the incumbent team in these places like South Ossetia in 2011, 2012, and Abkhazia in 2004, 2005, and the Russian-backed candidate lost. To another network that was also pro-Russian, but the pro-Russian network that Russia supported wasn't able to win. But Russia has been very effective at kind of using its ties and powers to undermine in these places the networks that it doesn't like, or that it wants to replace. But so Russia's better at kind of toppling than it is actually installing, I think. And so, but there's certainly ties, like in South Ossetia, there are tons of ties, exactly these personal networks between South Ossetians and North Ossetians and other structures in Russia. Same thing with Abkhazia. And so there is a kind of transnational element that plays out, but I haven't really given a whole lot of thought to how that plays out systematically, other than just, they matter for like resources and some other things. But despite these transnational links, the same general patterns I still find holding even in these Russian-occupied, essentially Russian-occupied territories.
Yeah, Alona Levionova wrote in her book about can Russia modernize, that precisely this kind of networking, what she calls Systema, blocks modernization processes even when the politicians, these networks try to modernize the country, try to get things done, as you've mentioned in your talk. And I will not open this bottle, but at least say it as a question which you have no chance to answer anymore. The relationship between these political structures and economic modernization, because for Russia it's one of the most important urgent questions that the economic reforms proceed in a way that the economy actually meets expectations to be and become even more powerful, super powerful leading country in that world. And I think if you look at the debate in Russia, always about innovation, modernization, change to get an economy which actually meets the expectations that Russia has about itself. And so this link between politics and economics, I think, is very important, and we should think more about it. I have the chance to ask you afterwards, but I think now we have not the time. You are tired. This was a long day for you. Outside on the floor there are drinks and pretzels and a little wine. Please help yourself, and thank you much for coming, and have a